Hello, everyone.
Hello.
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 Over the next couple minutes, I'm just going to be letting a few people come in. I have to admit them all one by one. It's good to see some of your all's faces. I've met some of you all before, but I've certainly seen some names. So it's good to see names with faces and applications. As we are waiting for just a few others to join, any just initial questions that you all have, I will certainly give a lot more thorough description of the training. But if there's any easy questions or random questions that I could answer, happy to do that as we're letting people in.
Jay, quick question. How long do you reckon this will be? Is it an hour or?
It'll be about an hour. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So I will probably share for, I don't know, somewhere between 20, 30 minutes and then interact with questions that you all have as well.
I have sorry. I have a question.
Yes.
I'm echoey here.
All good. Hi, April.
Hi. Do you have any book recommendations that could help us in this journey?
Oh, journey into what? Any specific books you're looking for?
Christian sexual healing.
Yes. That is part of the problem that exists in the world today is that I wish all of those words were synonymous, but often they are not. And that's part of what I'll talk about in a little bit is, I mean, there are certainly, authors, organizations that are doing some really solid work in this realm. And part of what I find is that you really have to diversify who you read and who you integrate. Because a lot of times, some of the best work that's being done out there with regard to sex and sexuality is not being done in the Christian space. And so, as you look at a lot of what's happening in terms of research. I mean, you're going to read books like, Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are, which I think is one of the best books out there with regard to female sexuality. And yet there's often some places within that book that I might have more questions and integrate. So I don't ever try and just read people that I completely agree with. I try and read very broadly to try and get a sense of what are they saying that I have certain biases and blind spots to, but also how can I integrate very widely? So, all that to be said, I think that there are Christian organizations and authors that are doing some of that work, but I would never kind of just, um, only read those authors. So I would kind of broaden it beyond that. But I think organizations like the Allender Center are doing good work around, trauma and sex. They're not necessarily addressing a robust vision of sexuality. Who else is? I'll have more names in a little bit, April, to give you, but
I think I've read all of Emily's books.
Julie Slattery is doing some work as well, rethinking sexuality. So she would look at my book, Unwanted, and kind of say it's doing a good job to address some of the downstream issues. But for her, she's trying to go upstream. So one of the I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I'm not sure if I can isolate who has an unmute, but I'm basically hearing myself two or three times. So if I mute you, it's nothing personal. I just can't make sense of what I'm saying. So, okay, I think no worries, Marcus. I think that fixed it. Now I can hear myself and can hear other people. So let's get started with regard to going over the unwanted guide training. So first off, I just want to thank you all for taking some time on a Friday afternoon in the summer to explore this training. So grateful to be with you all, get to know you a little bit. And as I said at the beginning of the call, I want to leave a lot of time for question and answer as well. But I think part of where I would get us started with regard to the unwanted guide training is to tell you some of the origin stories of it and then move into what do we actually do in the unwanted guide training. So origin stories of this training go back to 2020. You all may remember a global pandemic sometime in March. And essentially, what happened then is my book had been released, I think, in the previous year, and was doing different trainings at different organizations and churches and faith-based denominations. And with COVID, became very apparent that we need to pivot to something more of an online model. So that was what we started back in March of 2020. And I think since then, we've probably had, I don't know, 125, 150 guides go through the program. And so part of why we created it beyond just COVID and the virtual world is that, I mean, this is even to April's question. What other resources do you recommend with regard to human sexuality and approaching this from a Christian perspective? And there's just not a lot out there. So I always think about who do we have to thank for this? Well, we have a lot of people to thank, but a lot of the church fathers did not handle issues of sexuality or gender very well. Augustine, if you read his confessions, would say that the frenzy of lust gripped me and I surrendered myself entirely to it. And essentially, what happened there is he hated his sexuality. He had a lot of lust that, internet pornography was not around back in the fourth century. And so for him, it was orgies and desire for infidelity. And anytime a leader really despises something of their sexuality, they are going to pass on either a lot of suppression or a lot of self-hatred and a lot of management systems. And I think that's largely what we have inherited today when we look upstream at things like purity culture and just some of the profound moral failures within the church is there has been a lot of suspicion, a lot of anxiety, a lot of nervousness around sex historically, and that has pervaded our churches. So a lot of times, especially as leaders who are coming out of faith-based contexts, whether you work with Christian clients or parishioners or not, you have something of that internalized anxiety and nervousness inside of you. And that tends to be something that just doesn't allow us to do really good work. So when I look out at the field, I will often try to talk about two core frameworks that I'm seeing in the world today. And this is an oversimplification of it. But in some ways, there is the lust management approach, and that is usually a model that is trying to pathologize a lot of sexual desire and unwanted behaviors. And so out of those models, you have things like, I won't even name books, but some of the best-selling books in this space, particularly with unwanted sexual behavior, will tell people to present their body will basically tell wives to present their body as a merciful vial of methadone to their husbands if they are struggling with an area of porn. I'm gonna have to mute someone else. If you are not on mute for right now, would you mind muting yourself? So they would, basically just say, present your body as a merciful vial of methadone, and created just context of a lot of madness, marital rape coming out of that, And so then you look at other models with regard to unwanted sexual behavior. And if you're familiar with my work, you know that I talk about this quite a bit, but it's a lot of lust management. So I was talking to a clinician the other day who's a Christian therapist in New York. And one of the things he said is, Jay, how many push-ups do you recommend I I give to my client to combat lust? And I was like, where are you even coming from? How many push-ups? And he's like, yeah, to basically change their self-state. And I thought about it for a moment and I was like, well, not too many, because if your client begins to feel more sexually attractive and more desirable as a result of push-ups, you're going to have an even greater problem on your hands. So there's just this built-in Christian framework, and this is like a well-trained therapist that is trying to manage and monitor sexual behavior. So I think that paradigm does not work. It does not develop people. But then when we're looking at a lot of the more progressive frameworks, I love that they are trying to reduce the shame and stigma associated with people's sexual choices. But I read some of the best-selling books in that space, and I am equally dismayed at how underdeveloped they keep people. So one of the best-selling books in infidelity, there's an example of a guy who cannot be home alone by himself without going to porn or going to get full body sensual massages when his wife goes out of town. And the solution that the author, that I really trust a lot of her work, comes up with is that he is supposed to bring his wife into his personal red light district, and they are supposed to have sexual experiences together that basically bust some of their own sexual feelings and paradigms. And so there's no discussion of what is driving this person to pursue pornography, what's driving him to pursue full-bodied sexual massage, very little understanding of kind of a window of tolerance, and how does this person not eroticize his own loneliness. So there is so much out there that I just find really troubling. And here's what I would say with both the lust management and shame management paradigm is that they both keep people wildly underdeveloped. And so I would just say the unwanted guide training kind of came out of that, of what is a third way to really invite leaders to engage these areas that does not overly pathologize everything and see everything as a sex addiction, but also does not give carte blanche to people to just kind of say, you become a law unto yourself and you decide what is good for you. Because all of the research would also say that our desires can be built up within us without any understanding of where they came from. So there was this really fascinating study that looked at they basically gave people word pairings. And so the word pairings were ocean and moon, that they gave to some control group or to one group, and then they did some other words to another group. And then they asked the people who were given the word pairing ocean and moon to list what their favorite detergent was. And it was like statistically more significant that the people given ocean and moon were would say that Tide was their favorite detergent of all time. And so they were statistically significantly influenced by this word pairing, but they had no idea. And so what the researchers would say is that desires can be built up within us without any conscious awareness of where they come from. And to me, that should open up so much curiosity within all of us to say, like, all of our desires, where do they come from? Do they come from our family of origin, our story? Do they come from some of the dynamics that we see taking place in culture? And so part of this training was like me thinking, could we actually create a training where people are really curious about why people are doing what they're doing, and that resist the temptation to pathologize, but also resist, I think, an easy temptation to normalize as well. So, what we want to say is that, yes, unwanted sexual behaviors, sexual difficulties are normal, but they are never random. And that's largely where we were coming from with kind of some of the conceptual nature of this training. Additionally, as I started talking with a lot of my colleagues and friends, and probably I could even pose this question to you all, and feel free to put your answers in the chat. But how many of you had more than one class or one course in human sexuality in the entire duration of your training, as you got your master's in counseling, your master of divinity, you became ordained, became a coach? Um, uh, Ken says 0. The average is, I'm seeing 1. I saw someone said 1. That's the average. So the average therapist has had one class in human sexuality in the entire course of their master's training, and oftentimes it's in sexual pathology. So the comparison that I would like you to have here is, imagine seeing a cardiologist who has only had one class in understanding the human heart. You would not go to see them. And yet that's the reality for most of us as leaders in this field, is that we are under equipped to understand some of the dimensions of our clients' lives. And here's part of what we've learned through this training. Most therapists, pastors, coaches are really not much better off than their clients with regard to unwanted sexual behavior, sexual shame, low desire. So they are basically counseling people, trying to learn as they go and maybe integrate a book or two there. And so when we looked at the pathologizing, the normalizing, but also the just how underdeveloped people were in this area, we said we need to create a training program that really helps people to understand their story, and then to build a bridge between how does their story shape their unwanted sexual behaviors and some of their own sexual difficulties. So part of what I want you to hear from the outset of this is that um, this training is not just left brain training. It's not something that you just get a course for. We are going to ask you to go very deep into your own story. We're going to ask you to go into some of your own sexual difficulties, obviously, never to an extent that you would not feel honoring to share to yourself. We want you to have some level of honor and just a sense of kind of context. But we ask a lot of the people that go through this program in terms of addressing their family of origin, exploring their trauma, exploring their arousal templates, exploring some of the sexual difficulties that they are facing right now, or at least historically. And so want you to hear that from the outset, that this is a deeply personal training where you are going to get, I think, some great teaching, some great integration work between the realms of theology and psychology. And you are going to be asked to do some of your own work in this area. Why do we do that? Well, part of what a couple Carl Jung quotes, he would say that, no leader can take anyone else further than they have been themselves, some version of that quote. And then the other thing that he says about parenting is, he says the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of his or her parent. So the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of his or her parent. If I were to adapt that quote for the world of therapy and clergy, I would say the greatest burden a client, a parishioner must bear is the unlived life of his leader or her leader. So we have designed a training program to really go deep into your story. And so part of what I want to do over the next, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes is to go through some of the just kind of key concepts of the training. And then after I'm done with that, I will field any questions that you might have. So from the start, the unwanted guide training, actually, I see Chris's hand. So Chris, let me answer your question and then I'll dive in. You probably raised it a while ago, so I'll come back to you. All right. So the Unwanted Guide Training is 13 weeks long, and it is built around the three sections of my book. So the first section is essentially how did I get here? The second is why do I stay? And then the third is how do I get out? So the first couple weeks of this training, on week one, you will have an orientation to your group. We keep groups very small. You can expect about 5 to 6 people in your group, and then the groups will be led by a trained facilitator on my team. They have, usually gone through, most of them have all gone through this training or some version of this training. We have a number of facilitators that have been connected to the Allender Center, have been senior fellows, have been teaching staff for them. But they have also received a lot of training from, I don't know, they are well-trained people. I don't put anyone in a facilitator role unless I would trust them with, working with a dear friend or family member of mine. And so the groups are basically led by a core facilitator, and then you will have about 5 or 6 people in the group with you. So the you know three stages of the training are: first we dive into stories. So in week one, your facilitator will dive into their story. We very much believe that no leader has any right to ask you to go where they have not gone themselves as well. And so part of what the leader will do in that first week is to share some about their story, how they got in there. They'll do introductions. And then in weeks 2 through 6 or 2 through 5, um, are you all having problems with my audio? No, someone else's. Okay. Um, but then in weeks 2 through 5, we are really going to ask you all to write your own stories. So you will write a story of about 750 to 1,000 words with regard to your family of origin. And then you will also write a story about a core adverse childhood experience that you went through. And then you will read that story in group with uh, other group members. And so part of why we designed it that way is, a lot of us have been trained under Dan Allender. That's definitely an Allender Center model of working through stories. But as a leader, you can't see your own face. That, outside of a selfie, outside of a mirror, you really don't know your story very well until you can begin to submit it to others. And then they are able to offer feedback, get a sense of kind of where you feel stuck, maybe where you have negative core beliefs that you weren't aware of. Maybe there are certain dynamics within your family of origin that you had never thought about before. And that's really the purpose of some of those stories. So let me share. Hopefully, I can share my screen. Okay, can you all see this? Yeah. Um, so conceptually, what we are leading you all through would be something. There's a lot of different story models out there, but this is one that I've developed that I probably riffed off of someone else. But we believe that everybody's story starts with some level of desire. That when you think back to some of your family of origin, you had to want something, that there was something in your life that, as a young boy, as a young girl, there was a sense of innocence and desire to you. But somewhere along the line, there was some radical disruption, some trauma, some incident that really began to negatively shape the trajectory of your life. So, if we were to think about this model just in terms of the Lion King for a minute, uh, tell me, I'll kind of let you all share just a little bit about Simba. So, when we first see Simba at the beginning of The Lion King, what does Simba want? And anyone can answer. And you might have to unmute yourself for this because I cannot see the chat right now.
I think he wants to
Anybody?
be king and take his dad's place one day.
Yes, thank you, Jim. Yes, he wants to be king, and then there's this scene where he's basically allowed to go anywhere that the light touches. But where does Simba want to go? Does anyone remember?
In the dark, the place the light doesn't touch, the forbidden land.
The Forbidden Land. Yes, he wants to go to the elephant graveyard, right? And that is true of all childhood desire. I want you to think about childhood desire as like a seed. So, all desires start out as the seed, and for a seed to grow, transgression is necessary. The seed needs to be able to break through. The root needs to go down in order for the shoot to emerge. And so, right out of the gate, that's true of all of us as kids, is that we want something. And maybe we were told not to go somewhere. Maybe we were told that we shouldn't want what we want. Maybe we were told that we were selfish for wanting. But inevitably, there is this sense of desire that moves the story forward, but inevitably there is going to be some level of disruption. And so for Simba, what happens to Simba as he goes to the elephant graveyard? Anybody? Anybody remember? No one? Okay. So hyenas come out there, and his dad has to come and rescue him. But then on the way back, there are, I think, all these wildebeest that come in, and then Scar basically uses this as a context to kill Mufasa, and then it essentially frames Simba for the death. After that happens, Simba goes out into a type of darkness and exile. And that's what happens to all of us after trauma, is that we end up out in exile. And for Simba, he's hanging out with baboons and wildebeest, or not baboons, he's hanging out with like a wildebeest and a meerkat, and basically sabotaging, as Jim said, this call, this desire to be a mighty king. But then, in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the exile, this figure shows up. And first, it's a friend, but far more, it is a baboon by the name of Rafiki that kind of hits him on the head and reminds him of his calling, reminds him of where he comes from, of his origin story, and then tells him of some of the dire straits that they are in, and then encourages him to come home. Then there's this epic face-off with Scar, and he ends up defeating Scar, and then the Pride Lands are restored to a level of peace, right? So that's Pixar understands this, the writers of scripture understands this, that's what's happening. So our premise with each of you is that there is a level of innocence and desire within you that is good and beautiful and true. But somewhere along the line, there was some radical disruption in your story. And that could have come through just having a father who was a sadistic man. That could have been from having a mother who was wildly insecure and yet absorbed her life into you and ate you as a type of Eucharist. It could have been, some level of sexual abuse that you experienced as a child growing up, but there was some level of disruption that then threw you into a level of darkness and exile. And maybe for some of you, that threw you into your own unwanted sexual behaviors as a type of reenactment. For some of you, you might struggle far more with a sense of low desire, or a sense of like, I live with a civil war of desire, and desire creates madness within me. So I would rather just suppress my desire and turn it off than to have to live with some of the difficulties of desire. So you end up living professionally or not in a level of darkness, in a level of exile, feeling like I don't love my sexuality, I don't love my desire. In many ways, I don't love my story. But then into that plot arrives a book, a mentor, a therapist, a friend that kind of hits you all over the head like Rafiki and reminds you of this calling, reminds you of your desire to feel good and true and beautiful, to do really good work with those that you serve. And in the midst of this, you begin to understand your own story. You become much more comfortable within your own arousal template and working through your own story. And lo and behold, you start doing some very tremendous work with clients and people that you serve. That would be an unwanted guide story that we are hoping for within this, but also part of the framework that we are teaching you as you go through the training program to kind of understand your clients' lives and those you serve through a similar framework. I'll just show one more that we think about, a similar trajectory, but it starts with desire, freedom, innocence. And then after that, every single individual that you are working with has known some level of humiliation, powerlessness, or shame. And then there are certain vows and agreements that get formed within them about, like, my desires can't be trusted. I'm too weak. I'm too insecure. There's something about me that's flawed or broken. And then they make these vows and agreements with themselves about that. And then category 4, they will find behaviors that reinforce those core beliefs. And that's really key. That's a really key distinction of this training, is that a lot of times when you are getting trauma informed care, or trauma informed trainings, a lot of therapists and leaders will talk about how, trauma is operative in clients' lives. And so, therefore, when they pursue an addictive behavior or compulsive behavior, it is a type of self medicating. And on one hand, that is true. We do pursue behaviors because they provide a reprieve from some of the humiliation, powerlessness, and shame of our life. But one of the core tenets of this program is that you will also pursue behaviors that confirm your core belief about yourself. And so if you believe that there is something broken or unwanted within you, you will inevitably pursue behaviors that provide something of like evidence in the court of law against you to convince yourself that that is true. So everybody is pursuing behaviors that provide a form of self-medicating. And what is equally true, if not more, is that people are also pursuing behaviors that reinforce judgment in their life. So that's just, brief preview of, the story dimension, is that we're going to ask you to dive into your story, but also that's part of the conceptual background of how we train people to think about story and work with it. The second component of the training is we dive into the second part of my book, which is why do you stay? So everybody wants to outgrow their unwanted sexual behavior, but until clients and parishioners really understand why they keep going back to it, they will continue to pursue their unwanted behaviors. And so part of what we're looking at here is based in Lacanian psychoanalysis. And essentially what Jacques Lacan would say, and he was so brilliant on this point, is he would say that every person in your congregation, every person in your clinical practice has a symptom. There is no person on the planet without a symptom. But Lacan was French, and so he would do this wordplay between symptôme and saintôme. So symptôme is the French word for symptom, but saintôme, if I'm pronouncing that right, is the French word for holy man or prophet. And that's the key point for Lacan, is every symptom is the holy prophet, is the holy man trying to make something apparent to the patient because they have not been willing or able to address it for themselves. So every symptom is communicating something very important for people to understand. And so when we're thinking about sexual fantasies, when we're thinking about unwanted sexual behaviors with ourselves, but also those we serve, we are training people to think about these as symptoms, as as holy prophets that are trying to say the thing that cannot be acknowledged by the patient. So I think this is really consistent with, Romans 12:2, which says, "Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." You cannot renew your mind and you cannot help others renew their sexual mind if they don't know why they are drawn towards it in the first place. And so, a really key component of this training is that we want people to be very curious about people's behaviors. And that's one of the important reasons why we do the story work first, is because we want to build that bridge between how does this unaddressed story in your life really shape and inform your unwanted sexual behaviors. And if you can build that bridge, then you, as a therapist, as a coach, as clergy, really have a core sense of what the person is trying to work through. So we want to develop a lot of curiosity for people. We work through different models for trying to understand particular strategies of unwanted sexual behavior. And if you've heard a podcast or a conference with me, one of the concepts that I work with quite a bit in this area is the category of reversal. So we'll talk about reversal, reenactment, and revenge as core strategies of unwanted sexual behavior. And I don't have time to unpack each of those now, but reversal is taken from Harry Potter. And Harry Potter, there's this great scene where Harry looks into the mirror of Erised, and Erised is desire spelled backwards. And so when Harry, as an orphan, looks into the mirror of Erised, what he sees is an image of his parents. But then when his friend Ron Weasley looks into the mirror of Erised, what Ron sees is he's like the head of his house. He's the champion Quidditch player, kind of more of a narcissistic Mirror of Erised presentation for Ron. But as you know something of his backstory, you know that he comes from a family where a lot of his brothers were overshadowing him. Ron never quite feels like he measures up. And so his mirror is to reverse a lot of this, the powerlessness and difficulties that he has experienced. So that's one way to think about unwanted sexual behavior, is that it's often a type of mirror of Erised moment of maybe you're in a marriage that has become fairly tepid or contemptuous, and yet there is something about an affair partner or the possibility of an affair partner that allows you to feel alive in life. And so in the past, you may have just indulged the desire to have the affair, or you've just tried to pathologize it instead of seeing, no, there's something about the desire for the affair that is something of a mirror of Erised that's reflecting back to you something about your marriage, maybe something about your family of origin. And so everything that we do is washed in curiosity with regard to, I wonder why people are doing what they're doing. And we don't have any sense of, here's the encyclopedia of exactly why people are doing things, but we want to be able to raise a lot of curiosity and questions and a couple different hypotheses with regard to why people have pursued what they have pursued. And then finally, the question of how do we get out of here? We do a lot of work on establishing healthy relationships, community for leaders. And so one of the best definitions that I love about trauma, this comes from Gabor Mate, who I think is riffing off of something that Peter Levine said. But he said that trauma is not just what happens to us, trauma is what happens inside of us in the absence of an empathetic witness. So trauma is not just like this big T trauma that happened to us. It's also something that happens within us in the absence of an empathetic witness. And that's what your group is. That's what your facilitator is we know from a lot of the feedback and surveys that we've taken from people that have gone through this training program is people will say, training felt a little bit like a misnomer. There was also parts of this that felt like group therapy. But part of what people will say is that they never ever anticipated an empathetic witness to the degree that they did with regard to their own story, but also their own sexual difficulties that they were facing. Because back to what I was saying at the beginning, most of us have not seen our own therapist or our own coaches through a lot of these difficulties at this level. And certainly, one class or one course in human sexuality is not going to help you connect the dots between how your story and sexual difficulties emerge. And so that's part of what we believe is that in going through this program and receiving something of an empathetic witness, not just with your story, but also with your sexual story and sexual difficulties, that changes people in ways that you cannot fathom and also increases competence. It increases confidence in working with others. And so those are the three movements of the training. How did you get here? Why do you stay or why did you stay? And then how do you get out of here through things like self-care, healthy relationships, community, and meaning? And those are the three movements of the training. So I'll pause there and then just pivot just quickly into what are guides doing with the training now, and then I will open it up for question and answer. So we have people that have gone through this program to do some of their own personal work, and that's why they signed up. It was just to do some of their own personal development work in this area. We also have, a lot of people that are connected to churches that want to create healthier organizations. They want to create sexually healthy churches. And so they are willing to go first on behalf of their congregation, on behalf of their staff, to be able to get some training, to be able to bring some stuff back to their communities. You will go through the journey course. You'll have lifetime access as with this training, and people will. Let me back up. So we have kind of clergy that will go through it to be able to raise, just some awareness within their churches to kind of take the first step to lead their organizations to become sexually healthy. But then we also have a number of therapists and coaches that go through this to really build their clinical practice. Sometimes people come into this, they might be pre-licensed or maybe have just gotten their license and are trying to figure out if they want this to be a particular niche for them or not. Or you might have a seasoned therapist that will say, just kind of out of nowhere, I started working with 4 or 5 couples that like were dealing with infidelity and porn issues, and I had some training there, but I wanted more. And then we have other therapists and coaches that I would say are running their whole coaching or counseling practices off of Unwanted and the Journey course. So uh, they will get a lifetime access to this. The Journey course is an 18-week program, and they run a lot of groups around the Journey course. And then they use some of the trainings and what they learned from this training in their private practices. We will also keep a list of everybody who has gone through this training and where they are in the country or where they are in the world. And so when people reach out to my team wondering if there is a therapist or a coach or a church that's utilizing some of these materials, we love to be able to point people back to people in particular zip codes or states that are doing this work. I can't promise referrals at all. If it didn't happen, we'd have refund requests, which we can't honor. But just the sense of we do try to pair people, as they request a particular therapist, coach, or church that's working with this material. And that might be down the road for you all. So I'm going to stop talking for a little while just to see what questions do you have based on what I shared? What can I clarify? theoretical questions, practical questions. Happy to field it all. And I will try and catch up. I have like 42 new messages, so I'm not quite caught up. Scott, I see your hand, and Rebecca, I see your hand. So I'll go Scott first and then over to Rebecca.
Hey, thanks. I benefited a lot from Unwanted, but then I talked with a friend about it, and he wasn't. He just wanted more Jesus and gospel content. So
Yep.
what's your like philosophy? And I think he's coming from like a biblical counseling. My
Yeah.
straw man is like a Bible verse a day keeps the devil away. But like, what's your balance and philosophy on that
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
regards to your approach?
Yeah, so I am, always trying to get a sense of integration. And, just a phrase that we all know well these days, there's so much spiritual bypassing. And so one of the things I learned very quickly in training people who used to be in the biblical counseling realm is that they would actually tell me and confess to me that they brought in Jesus and the gospel when they did not know where to go clinically with a particular client. And so they were using Jesus to escape entering into places of death and destruction, and trauma and abuse. So part of what I believe as a Christian is, you know, if we're looking at Holy Week, and I'll just simplify it by saying Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday. What is Good Friday? It is a day of trauma. A dead Messiah. Jesus was, obviously physically abused, but also if you're working with Roman guards who love to humiliate, Jesus undoubtedly had a level of sexual abuse in his own story with regard to what happened on Good Friday. But then Holy Saturday is a day of exile. It's a day where a dead Messiah is a failed Messiah, and there's no promise of resurrection. And then obviously Easter Sunday is a day of resurrection and ascension power that follows. But my point there is that if you begin to stay in people's Good Friday experiences, you know the experiences of abuse, of trauma, where there are no words to be uttered. There's just heartache and loss. If you honor Good Friday, you actually honor the story of Jesus just simply by entering into trauma. If you don't try to just bring Easter Sunday to people, but you can stay in something of the agony of what Holy Saturday is, you are honoring something of who Jesus is and what Jesus went through with regard to Holy Saturday. So, so much of my work is theologically informed, but I'm not just trying to bring Jesus into someone's abuse scene or just ask people to see where was Jesus within this, or how does Jesus forgive you of your sins and wash you of all unrighteousness. Well, part of what Jesus also said is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. I have never, ever worked with a client who came in to say, I need to mourn and I need to experience comfort for my story. Instead, they ask for forgiveness. They say that there's something broken and terrible about them. And so, all that to say, I think there is so much about Jesus and good theology that doesn't demand that you have to bring Jesus in or bring God every time. Oftentimes, at least in my experience with therapists and pastors, is that a lot of times when it is brought in, it's not very helpful to the story. So I think Jesus and the Spirit of God are far more committed to my clients than I could ever be, but I don't necessarily know when the Spirit of God is going to show up, but I believe that the Spirit will in a particular time and place. And often it's not through a sermon or through a counseling moment. It's on a random Tuesday evening where something of the goodness of God comes to find people in the midst of darkness. Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you, Jay, for doing this crazy hard work. My question is, I'm going to facilitate my first NFTC one group and with the Allender Center, which I'm very excited about.
Awesome.
But
Congratulations.
thank you. Thank you. I want to do a deeper dive into this specificity for story work because it tends to be so fraught and tender, and I still need to do a lot of work in my own story. So I'm thinking this is the right place to be, but I also have a lot of ambivalence about just the kind of care I'm gonna get. And I want to dive in the deep end. I've been diving in the deep end.
Yes.
And I just have a little bit of, yeah. So is this a good,
Absolutely. Yeah.
there's just still a lot going on for me, and I'm very aware of
I
that.
hear you. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think it's so good to know that about yourself. And I would say that to everyone on this call, like there will be disruption as a result of this training. It will be disruption in your potentially your professional life, your personal life. As you begin to mess with these themes, there will be things that are that will be buoyant for you. And so part of what I would say in that is like, your group leader, that's part of what they're there for, is in the check-in times to be able to help process that. Uh, there's time and space for that, but also part of what we have learned is that this doesn't happen in every group, but some groups will have people like what you just shared with regard to the vulnerability, and some groups will meet every week outside of group times as well, just to be able to process and integrate. And we don't make any requirements on that. And that can change group dynamics if some people are agreed to it, but not everybody agrees to it. But we have seen that happen. And, some training models like the Allender Center, which I love, they do quarterly training. So you'll have your September, your November. And so there can be a lot of time and space in between meetings. We meet in basically 13 consecutive weeks. So there is, continuity, and people have really enjoyed that they're in the material pretty consistently. You will also have, I believe it's like 2 or 3 one-on-one calls with your facilitator, and that's a really good time to process on an individual call, not in group, just kind of what's coming up for you, questions that you have, be able to find some grounding. But if you know that you could use some extra care, we always encourage people to see a therapist, a coach, as they go through this process. But I think it is good, as Rebecca said, you have to count the cost. You have to be able to say, can I bear this disruption? Am I entering into a season where this would be good? And I will say that although that this is, whenever you're dealing with the limbic brain and the right brain, and you're heading back into these self states as a child, but time travel is exhausting. So when you're working with your 7-year-old self, your 11-year-old self, you're going to feel fatigue. But also, people come out of these trainings feeling like they have something of their life back. They feel energized. They're like, wow, this shame that I've been holding, or this dynamic in my life, where I feel really empowered to do this work. So it's not, there is exhaustion, but there's also, I think, really remarkable empowerment through this as well. So, Rebecca, I know I'm not answering your question clearly, but yeah, if you're in a wildly busy season, and you know that you're going to be somewhat distracted, I don't think I would recommend it in this particular season. But if there is a hunger and a desire for more in this season, and you have some good support both from your group and maybe a good friend or a good therapist, I think you can get through this.
Thank you.
Aiden. And I'm happy to go a little bit. I know some of you might have a hard stop at 4 Eastern, 1 Pacific. Certainly willing to go a little bit over to answer questions. So
Okay, yeah. My question just really quick was, are all the facilitators going to be registered counselors?
Yes, so we have every facilitator is a licensed mental health counselor. We also, but there is one that's he's like a certified pastoral counselor, got trained through the Allender Center, was a fellow, and has had, he's got a lot of credentials behind his name as well. But we have 4 or 5 facilitators right now, and oftentimes his Scott's group will have it not this isn't always the case, but a lot of times he will be paired with other pastors as well. But there's definitely licensed therapists that have been through his group as well. So I think everybody except for one person has been through all the Allender Center training. Some people were co-founders of the Allender Center, so we do a lot of work in connection with them.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. And Brady, it looks like you are next in line. I love how Zoom, I mean, it makes sense they do this, but they kind of shuffle everybody up to the top and move everybody along. It's great.
I'll try to be brief. I have 2 questions, and at the risk of sounding arrogant here, I'm just going to fire away. So I've been doing this
Go
work
for
for
it.
like 10 years, inside the church, and then outside the church as a licensed professional counselor for a year. I utilize EMDR, and
Yeah.
a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy in this. And I found your method to be the thing. Like everything else up to this, I felt wanting. It left
Mm.
wanting. It was like the whole snap yourself on the wrist and march around like army men, was just ridiculous. And it didn't
Oh,
really give
yeah.
anything. And I'm using this now. I've walked through my story and with many people, and I do love that approach to it, because it's, yeah, how the heck can I help you through something I've never been through? So that's
Hmm.
all of this stuff that you're doing is huge. Um,
Yeah.
how do I, I guess what I'm getting at is, what does the $3,000 course like give me as a therapist that I'm not already doing? There's my
Hmm.
risk of sounding arrogant. Sorry.
No, it's a great question. Yep. I mean, I think that's part of the way that I would answer that is I never quite know the work that people have done, and that's my sense back to is I don't want to sound arrogant either, but we have a lot of people that say that they've done a lot of the work, and then they get in to do the work and it's like they've never done the work. And so that would
Hmm.
be one phenomenon that we experience quite a bit. But then there's also kind of elements devoted to there. We use a trainings or a program called Coach Accountable. And so there's a lot of work that people are doing with regard to just kind of writing their story, insights that they are gaining from Unwanted, from the Journey course, and from others. And so I can't answer that
Yeah.
specifically for
Yeah.
you. If there's something like more specific, would be happy to answer that. But most people come to this, I would say, with a sense of like, what else could I know about my life? What else have I missed up until this point? And that's
Mm,
part of the benefit of going through it with other professionals is that people are going to see you differently. So it's not
mm,
just what's happening in your story, but it's also what's happening in your style of relating. And of the 120 something people that have been through this, I will ask my assistant if this is not true. I don't think we've ever had someone complete the training that said that felt really redundant. I
oh,
wish I hadn't done that. So we also, for some of the reasons that you're raising, have started a level 2 training as well. And basically, if the first one is more about addressing your own story as a individual, the level 2 training is really getting into kind of the art and science of how do you do story work and how do you work with these themes specifically. And that came out of people going through the level 1 training with us, saying, I loved it. It altered kind of the way that I viewed myself and my story, and really cornered me with having to address a sexual difficulty that I had evaded throughout a lot of my own training and my own therapy. But now, how do I actually do more of this work? So that's part of where we came up with the level 2 training, is just people want more. So Brady, I wish I could answer that in a cleaner way for you. It's a 120% fair question to ask of, is this worth the time? Is it worth the money? I've been doing a lot of this work. And if you feel like genuinely that's true, obviously there's zero pressure to sign up for
Sure.
for this
Yeah,
training.
and I think it's
So
more like technique, like a laid out plan, I think is what
yeah.
I really look
Hmm.
for to walk
Okay.
through. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I'm going to go to some other questions, but if you have more for me, feel free to chime back in or email Nancy and I can try and
okay,
answer
thank you
more.
so much.
I forget, Kate, I think you were next, at least in my list, and then I see a couple names, so I'll just go in the order that they are on my screen. Kate?
Yeah, hi. I guess my question is, I don't know why everyone else is here, but I feel like I'm like odd one out because I'm not really associated with like I go to church, but I'm not like a pastor, I'm not like a counselor or anything like that. I actually just um shared my betrayal, I guess, journey on social media. And then of course
Okay.
I've had some people reaching out to me because it's such a prevalent issue in today's day and age. But I have
Hmm.
also led the peer desire groups locally at my church. And like ultimately, I want to be just like
Great.
a resource to people within my community, possibly doing groups at church, and then also being able to help. I have had more like men reaching out to me too for help
Hmm.
with, you know, their porn addictions and things like that. And I want to be able to offer them help
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you know, coming from somewhere other than me just being like, this is what worked for us. That can be helpful, but it's not going to help everyone, right? So I guess I'm
Thank you for
wondering
saying
what,
that. Yes.
yeah, I'm wondering what training or group or course or whatever that you would recommend, because I know you mentioned the journey and then there's this one and then the second one you just mentioned. Do you have a
Hmm.
suggestion about like where to start?
Yep. Yeah, so if you're interested in this training, I mean, you're not the odd one out. There are other people that have been through this trainings that, you know, how they are Instagram influencers that have been through
Mhm.
this, and they're not coaches, but they just have the ability to, yeah, they had a blog that went viral, a video that went viral, and then they went through this training as a result. So, you know, it helps you. Part of what Brené Brown talked about in her latest book was, she quotes the German philosopher who says, the limits of my world are the limits of my language. And so part of what this training offers and some of the other resources and Unwanted is we're developing language for people. So it, and that's really helpful as you go through the book, as you go through the course, as you go through this training, is you're learning a language system that I think is really helpful for people who are navigating and trying to outgrow unwanted behaviors and some of the
Yeah.
debris like betrayal trauma that comes out of that. So yeah, you could start with the journey course. The Unwanted Guide Training program comes with it. You get other resources. But yeah, you could start if you want like a lower cost investment. I think like lifetime access to the journey course is 150, 180, or it's like
Mhm.
25 a month, and you can sign up for the free month and then get a discount on future months. And it's like, I don't know. There's probably a
Okay.
way to hack the system. We don't bet it that much, but 24 bucks. Yeah, there are resources out there. And part of I'm not just saying this to be uh humble. I'm saying this because I genuinely believe it. Like when you think about healing, when you think about unwanted sexual behavior or trauma or betrayal trauma, I always think about these issues like a river, no different than the Mississippi. And so if you were to think about what is sexual healing, what does sexual growth and recovery look like, I think the work that I and my team are doing is one important tributary, but I think that there are other leaders out there and other organizations that are doing phenomenal work to address other tributaries that flow into it. So I don't think that you should ever think about this in terms of like, this is the one training or the one course that I should take. Um, I am a middle child, so I am always trying to get a sense of like, what is mom saying? What's dad saying? What are the siblings saying? So I am under the persuasion that you should read widely, learn widely, integrate as much as you can. And so some people go through this and then they'll go through the Allender Center and then they'll go through Richard Schwartz's IFS training and do
Mhm.
EMDR. So sometimes people see this as like a tool in their tool belt.
Yeah.
So don't think about this as the only one training because you will become over indexed in the unwanted method and you need more. So, but I
Yeah.
also think that the work that my team and I are doing is really beautiful, good work. So
Hmm.
go
Yeah.
widely. I should go. I don't know if Prasad or Beth are next. Could not tell. Prasad, I'll go you, and then to Beth.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jade. So I am from India. So firstly, I'd like to thank
Yes.
you for your book. My pastor got hold of your book, and it has been a great blessing for our community. There were 50 couples who have journeyed on towards the healing of sexual brokenness. So really, thank you so much.
Mm,
So I have two questions. The
thank
first
you.
question, yeah, thank you. So the first question is regarding the timing. What time would this course be? Would it be, say, the Eastern morning time, or would it be later in the day?
Yep. A great question. Email my assistant Nancy about that. So be depending on the facilitator, they have different times. So I think there are some groups that were like Monday from 12 to 2 Eastern time. I'm not sure what that would be your time zone. There's another guide or another facilitator that I think he does maybe like 5 to 7 Eastern, so like 3 to 5 Pacific is what time zone he's in. So they vary, but they're typically on Monday or Tuesday. And then 2 of the training weeks we are all together, and those are typically recorded. But then all the groups will be together on week 6 and week 13. So it varies a little bit, but they tend to be, I would say, between 10 and 5 p.m. Eastern.
Okay, okay, thank you. And the next question is regarding would we be certified as guides to help other people once we finish this course?
Mhm. So you won't be we aren't using the language of like a certified guide, but that's part of what you can list on your website. You can is to be able to say, basically I completed this training, this unwanted guide training. So we've played around with the language of certification, what that would look like. And how do we do that? Certification is just much more difficult because it's like, are we certifying coaches? Are we certifying licensed mental health counselors? And then just because that you have been through, the guide training doesn't necessarily mean that you're involved in clinical work or coaching work. And so it creates some legal and training dimension difficulties, but you can definitely list it as I went through the Unwanted Guide Training program, and people do that all the time on their websites, like their Psychology Today profiles or their websites, just so that people have a sense of other training that you've been through. And then obviously, people in India, like it's just, I think we have 1 or 2 people that might be using our work various places within India. But yeah, happy to point more people towards you, towards your church as well.
Thank you, thank you.
Uh, Good to meet you, Prasad. Darren, or no, sorry, I went Beth and then Darren.
Okay. Hi, yes, thanks for taking my question. So, you may have answered it somewhat with Kate, but so I'm a licensed mental health therapist in Orlando and am working
Okay.
with a man who has he spent 10 weeks with the Meadows outpatient program in Dallas, and he's
Mhm.
now, working through his steps and so forth. And so, in
Yes.
thinking about if I do this training, I mean, obviously there are different levels. Some people need more intensive cares, and so, and I have, a friend who's a CSAT, and of course that seems like another
Mhm.
level of care. And so,
Yes.
just sort of trying to get some understanding about where unwanted training would fit with that. I mean, because I'm trained in mostly
Mhm.
focused couple therapy, so obviously I work with a lot of couples and betrayal. So
Yes.
if you could kind of just talk to that, Jay, that would be helpful.
Oh, I don't know how to answer that, Beth. It's such a good question. And I mean, it also speaks to, you know, licensed therapists on this call probably know this, but in the world of sex therapy, there are two main schools. There are the CSATs, which are the certified sex addiction therapists trained under Patrick Carnes and others, and then there are the certified sex therapists. And it's they do not like each other at all. So the certified sex addiction therapists will often, you know, people will see them as like something that just they see everything as an addiction. They pathologize quite a bit. They charge exorbitant rates to go to these addiction treatment centers. And then the progressive side will kind of say, sex addiction doesn't even exist in the DSM, it's all a myth, all that kind of stuff. And then you have the certified sex therapist that would say like, yeah, like this is underdeveloped sexuality and out of control. They call it out of control sexual behavior if they're willing to go down that road. And they would say that there's a lot of different interventions that you can engage without trying to send people to inpatient treatment. And so again, back to something of that third way approach that we're trying to take is, do I think that there are times and places for inpatient treatment? Yes. Do I also think that more people go to those because therapists and organizations and leaders don't really know what to do? I do think that they are sent to organizations because therapists don't feel like they have the training or expertise to deal with them. So I think that that's usually, you have to get a sense of like what's the history of the client, unsuccessful treatment. Uh, we won't talk about this a ton in the training, but just co-occurring comorbidity. So oftentimes when you have someone that's struggling with compulsive sexual behavior, we used to think about things as like a barn silo where you're just a sex addict, you're just an alcoholic, but more of what we're learning from multiple studies is just that these things are co-occurring, that you will often see substance abuse, eating disorders, gambling as co-occurring morbidities with regard to, and in that case where you're dealing with gambling, which I think is so much more difficult to work with than compulsive sexual behavior, then that's part of the assessment process that I would make. But I think that's part of what we're trying to address in this training is I think therapists and coaches can do really good, solid work with people in this realm without always feeling like they need to refer to an inpatient program. But there are some good inpatient programs for people, and that's always contextual to me. So I
Mm,
don't know if I blurred the waters even more, Beth, or if I answered your question, but I think that's part of the learning curve for all of us is we're trying to
mm,
get a sense
mm,
of what's the best model, how do we encourage people to do
mm,
this work, and often that's where I'm trying to take like an approach to this issue that you have to do the story work. But then
mm,
I always recommend groups are a really good idea for people to, address your trauma, do the relational work, so I never view these things as a la carte menu options that you get to pick or choose. I think to really develop a client means that you have to help them understand their story. You have to help
Mhm.
them individuate and find differentiation. You have to learn how to help them connect relationally with people, and then develop healthy sexual behavior. And so there are many, many dimensions to that, and you can't always do that as one practitioner alone. But if you can get groups and diversify the care, I think clients have a good shot at really good recovery. But I just don't like I'm a CSAT dropout. I attended 2 modules and failed. I didn't fail the program. I didn't like where they were taking me. I felt like there was so much more to a person's story. And then just the sense of how they work to get all the information up front and, flush out a lot of the deceptive sexuality, which I fully believe you need to do within disclosure and
On with the insurance company.
mute that person. So I learn a lot from the CSATs. I just did not want to develop my practice around that model because I felt like it was missing some stuff. But I would say
Mhm.
the same thing to be true when I've gone through trainings with certified sex therapists. I feel like it's so refreshing, and then I'm also dismayed
Mhm.
at some
Yeah.
of it too. So
Yes. Well, thank you. That's helpful. I mean, story I think
yeah.
is of such value, and I do pick out some pathologizing with some of the
Mhm.
other trainings that I'm not comfortable with,
Yes.
more
Yeah.
so the curiosity. So thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. Darren, and you all are awesome for staying on this call. I know it is Friday afternoon, so I will be done in the next 3 to 5 minutes. So, Darren,
Yeah, I guess first you mentioned an email. Is where can we find the email for like follow-up questions? You said your secretary or someone. Because I'm
yeah,
sure.
I'm trying to send stuff into the chat, but I can only send a direct message somehow. But it's basically Nancy, Nanci, not Y, but Nanci at heartofmanjourney.com. So heartofmanjourney.com. And if you email jay at heartofmanjourney.com, uh, sometimes I see it. Nancy sees it as well. Um,
Okay,
but
perfect.
either of those,
Yeah.
Ken, don't look at Ken's response. Thank you for putting that in, but remove the Y. No worries. Nanci at Part of Man Journey. Got it.
So then with that, I guess my quick question, and I'll send the other stuff to that email, but quick question
Mhm.
is you mentioned the journey course. I hadn't even heard of that. I read your book and I've been on my journey
Yep.
the past few years, but found this course. So what would you describe? I'm a therapist looking at additional training. I also
Okay.
the training at the Institute of Sexual Wholeness I was looking at. And I didn't know, just kind of conceptual. I'm kind of looking at all these different things.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the journey, maybe a training at Institute of Sexual Wholeness, and this training? I'm kind of just weighing my options, I guess.
I don't think I know it. I know I've heard of Institute of Sexual
Okay.
Wholeness, but I'm not sure what they're about. Where like could not articulate what exactly they do. Do you have like a 20-second description of it?
I found it yesterday. I heard about it actually
Okay.
Julie Slattery.
Okay. Great.
It is their sex. It looks like sex therapist, so kind of connected to that. But
Yep.
people like oh, he writes a bunch on transgender and same-sex attraction. I can't think of his name, but he's one of the faculty members there.
Okay.
So
Got it.
it seemed reputable to some extent,
Okay.
but just finding it. So
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's like their niche is
yeah.
within that realm. So could be. But yeah, I mean, I think back to my previous point is I think what you do is you this goes back to that Annie Dillard quote that I think I mentioned on this call I mean, she said, I never knew I was a bell until the moment I was lifted up and struck. And I love that line so much. And why? Because like when I first heard Dan Allender speak at my dad's church in 2005, he ruined my life. Like, I knew that there was something about his level of honesty and engagement with the human heart and soul that I knew I needed to like disenroll from the seminary that I was going to in Seattle to follow him. And then I read Patrick Carnes's Out of the Shadows and some of his other books, and that bell was struck again of like, wow, I've never heard someone talk about stuff in this particular way. And then, people like Esther Perel, which I love so much of her work, I'm troubled by how she keeps people underdeveloped as well. But there was still something of a bell that struck when I read her work. And so I think those are the people that you follow is, okay, there was something in Unwanted that struck a chord, rang a bell, so follow it. But also it sounds like Julie's work has hit something in you as well. So I think like if you pay attention to the bells that are ringing inside of you, they will guide you to where you need to go. And I don't ever think it's just one person. Our world is too big. People are too gifted to just kind of follow someone as a guru. One helpful thing that Dan did when we were in a practicum course was he had a alumni come in and basically played the saxophone. And then the saxophonist basically talked about how he learned how to play the saxophone. And I don't know my saxophonist well outside of like Coltrane, but he talked about how he needed to learn two or three major jazz saxophonists. And he learned them and could puppet their lines and play their music unbelievably well. But then the point in time came where he needed to play his own music. But it was built on uh, all of the learnings that he had made from Coltrane and others. And so I think that's what trainings offer you is that you're going to learn some of my theory, some of Allender's theories, some of Julie Slattery, but that's where you're heading is what is this music that I want to eventually play? And that's the best success story that I can hear out of an unwanted guide training program is people begin to feel empowered to say, okay, there's a lot in the betrayal trauma space that no one is talking about. And so I'm going to take some of your material, but then also weave it in with other people's material to create something new. We've had other like aspiring authors come through just because they're trying to get a sense of their own story and development. But I think that's part of why you do a training is you get helpful information, but at some level there's something in your soul that's asking you to continue to go forward and this is kind of the next right step but it's not the only one. So I think that's the intersection of kind of like you know desire but also a sense of calling. And so if it is unwanted sexual behavior, I think this is a good one. But if there are other dimensions of sexuality and sexual health or story or trauma that feel like they are part of your calling, I would say go in another direction, but I think that's where the bell becomes important is, was it trauma? Was it something else that struck that chord? And then how do I go towards it? So I think last question, Rick.
Just a very quick question. I just
Yeah.
finished year 1 of
Oh,
NFTC. So I'm going
okay.
into year 2,
Congrats.
and I'm just wondering if this would be a little too much. Or should I just focus on the next year? Or is that just kind of up to me?
It's up. I have no idea how to advise you. I think we had someone do both last year. And I think they said it was workable. There were some really intense points. Part of what is different about this training is that it's every week for about 13, 14 straight weeks. And so there is homework to do. You're not just meeting every month, or I forget how often NFTC 2
About
meets.
every 8-9 weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
It's
So
pretty odd.
there's definitely a more consistent meeting with this, but it might be too much. Just don't know how to answer that for you. I know sometimes people are like, I want to get it all, and you've got time. So there will be groups next spring as well if you can't make it in the fall. And that would probably be the final thing is like, we are trying to book groups I think groups start on September 9th. So if you are interested, let us know. I know for some people, I didn't mention this, sometimes we have a sliding scale spot or two in particular groups. If finances are a particular issue for you, we can sometimes slide that if we have, I think we have like 1 or 2 sliding scale spots per group or something like that. So
Thanks, Jay.
Bryce, I can take one more question, then I need to go at this point.
I am so
Hey,
sorry. I
Bryce.
had to jump out and take a phone call and come back.
All
So
good. Welcome back.
if the question's already been asked, please just let me know and I'll take it offline. But I'm curious about how you, and I think I know the answer to your question, but how this training will integrate. I support a lot of men who experience same-sex attraction, but still subscribe to a biblical ethic for sexuality. And
Yep.
I've read the Unwanted book. I think the principles work really well, but I just wanted to get your comment on that and how this training might help me support these guys.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, similar to what we did in Unwanted, we will not necessarily specifically dive into same-sex attraction within this training. But often what will happen is that people within their own stories or their own past abuse, or in some of their own reenactments, that will be part of a group experience, is to kind of begin to engage that not from a conceptual layer, but from an individual person's story. So part of what I talk about this some in the training, but I think, you know, when I, as a clinician, am working with anyone, it, I think there's a spectrum of sexuality. I don't know anybody that really fits very squarely into I am only homosexual, I am only heterosexual. So as you begin to get into people's dreams, as you get into people's pornography preferences and what they watch, as you begin to get into friendships and desire and arousal and kind of just stories in general, I think there's something about bisexuality that is far more common than most people would ever begin to talk about. Just because desire is not always just like, you can't just isolate it. And so part of what we are helping people to work through is, what do you do with arousal? What do you do with desire? And obviously, we have core tenets and belief systems. I don't make everyone sign like this is what you have to believe about same-sex attraction kind of coming into this program or out of it, but that's what we hope to do, is we hope to see like, how do our stories shape our sexuality and some of the debris of heterosexual sexuality, same-sex sexuality. I don't think that there's any sexuality that is without debris. And so that's what we're trying to do, is not pathologize or normalize or legitimize, but really kind of say, like, what is some of the debris that we're working with, and also some of the patterns and some of the research that we find within particular realms. So whether that is infidelity, whether that's same-sex attraction. So for example, like part of the training with same-sex attraction in, I think it's week 6, when I talk about the arousal template, is a lot of men that I work with that would identify as same-sex, exactly what you just said, holding on to a biblical ethic. Some of their sexual fantasies are about finding a man that's very powerful, about, there's something about themselves that they have judged as weak and inadequate, and then their sexual fantasy begins to be this merger with a type of man that has the ability to complete them, dominate them at some level. So within that is some level of self-hatred that they are experiencing that becomes eroticized and projected onto this archetype of someone. Or they might be reenacting some dynamic of past sexual abuse, or they have never ever experienced any arousal for the opposite sex, and then that becomes a whole different issue. So I can never blanket one person's sexuality as this is only that. So that's part of what we're trying to do with the people that go through the training program, is to kind of say, there's so much at play within same-sex sexuality. There is so much at play within heterosexual sexuality. And when you get into a lot of those nuances, what you'll find is, yeah, there's a lot that we're working through and with. So
Thank you. I
thanks,
appreciate
Bryce.
that.
Yeah,
It's not so much
yeah,
about addressing the SSA, it's story work, which I'm
yeah,
excited for. So thank you.
yeah, definitely. Yep. Thank you all for your time today. I look forward to maybe seeing you all down the road, but kindness on your journeys either way. And thank you for the work that you all are doing in your communities and practices, and the work that you all are doing. I know you all are doing great work as well. So good to be with you all. Bye-bye.